I'm Ari Redboard, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the US federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. On today's TRM Talks, we are live from the cash room at the US Treasury Department. Last week, the White House dropped its digital asset report, and today I sit down with one of the primary authors, Tyler Williams, counselor to the Treasury Secretary for Digital Assets. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. In early May 2025, FinCEN issued a Section 311 finding designating Cambodia-based WeOne Group as a financial institution of primary money laundering concern. The proposed rule, if finalized, would prohibit U.S. financial institutions from maintaining correspondent or payable through accounts with WeOne or its affiliates, effectively quarantining them from the U.S. financial system. FinCEN found that between August 2021 and January 2025, WeOne facilitated at least $4 billion in illicit proceeds, including funds tied to North Korea cyber attacks and pig butchering scams. TRM has identified more than $120 million in scam-linked exposure in 2024 alone, nearly 80% of which came from pig butchering schemes. That deepened concerns over WeOne's role not just as a passive intermediary, but as a central facilitator of global cyber-enabled crime networks. The WeOne Group spans multiple interlinked entities: WeOne Pay, a fiat payment processor with minimal AML controls; WeOne Crypto, a virtual asset service provider used to convert and move funds; and Wawang Guarantee, a platform offering phishing kits, fake IDs, and even a proprietary stablecoin. These elements combine to deliver a full-stack laundering ecosystem, absent meaningful oversight. Strategically, this enforcement action underscores a shift in how authorities tackle illicit finance, targeting not only individual actors, but the infrastructure that enables scaling, including cloud services, opaque payment rails, stablecoins, and escrow guarantee platforms. WeOne's expansive network and institutional gaps made it a preferred route for laundering funds from North Korean cyber heists and romance scams alike. In closing, the Treasury's Section 311 proposal against WeOne signals a new enforcement frontier: financial quarantine of high-risk service providers embedded in cybercrime supply chains. For compliance officers, investigators, and policymakers, the takeaway is clear: disrupting service infrastructure is now frontline strategy in dismantling global illicit finance. And now, I sit down with Tyler Williams. Today, I am joined by friend and counselor to the U.S. Treasury Secretary for Digital Assets, Tyler Williams. Tyler, this is so cool. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Ari. It's a pleasure to be with you.
We have not done many TRM talks in person, but when you offered the opportunity to be in this space, in the cash room, I was like, absolutely, we are doing this in person. Could you kind of kick us off by just talking a little bit about this room that we're in?
Well, we're in the cash room in the U.S. Treasury Department, and it is quite a historic place physically. Many important events here have happened over the years. I think historically what's interesting about us talking about digital assets today and being in the cash room doing it is, a couple hundred years ago, this was actually a commercial bank that was supplying coins and currency to local other commercial banks. And it's sort of a banker's bank, if you will. And that kicked off in, I think, 1869. And also it held President Grant's inauguration. The reception, the party was physically here. So it has a lot of history in this room.
It's so cool. We have done a few TRM talks with former Treasury officials, and this room has come up in those conversations. Like, I had this meeting here, or this Treasury Secretary was sworn in this room, but we've never been in it before. So thank you so much. This is just absolutely awesome.
Yeah, it is great. And, we'll get into this a little bit, but a lot of the roundtables and the discussions that we did to sort of inform our thought process on the big report that we released last week, we physically did here as well. So to your audience, they'll see a familiar setting.
I love it. That's amazing. We are here today to talk about the 180-day report that the White House put out last week. You were one of the primary authors of that report. I have a copy right here.
It looks good, doesn't it?
It really does look great. Before we dig into that, you and I spent some time at Treasury together in the prior Trump administration. You were in the private sector working on digital assets and other issues. You're back at Treasury. Would you just talk a little bit about your journey to this moment, which I feel like in some sense this really culminates in this report?
Sure, absolutely. Well, yeah, I've been working in policy and sort of financial services policy for quite some time. And prior to working with you last time in Trump 1 at Treasury, I worked on Capitol Hill for quite some time, almost 8 years in the House and the Senate, exclusively focused on financial services policy matters. It wasn't dedicated to digital asset policy, but it's interesting to see sort of the life cycle of how policy has sort of matured in Washington relative to the issues. And I would say if you look back on 2016, 2017, there wasn't that much activity on digital asset policy in Washington. And I think that has really accelerated through some fits and starts over the years. And even if you think back 3 or 4 years ago where we were debating in Washington policy circles of advancing legislation on stablecoins, that seems to be a long time ago now that we have the genius legislation enacted. We have this comprehensive report that has been published, and it seems like there's a lot of momentum in Congress to advance market structure legislation. So I kind of think about the digital asset policy ecosystem as sort of a three-legged stool. We have stablecoins, we have market structure, and then we have this report that is all of the different issues across the ecosystem in digital assets that we've put on paper, and it's sort of a roadmap of what we want to accomplish. And there's hundreds of recommendations in there that span tax policy, payments policy, banking policy, illicit finance, market structure, sort of the watershed of issues.
What's really extraordinary is, literally just, and this goes to your point, 4 or 5 years ago, we were talking about a few of the issues in here, and this is an over 160-page report. We mentioned TFI, the Office for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, where I worked. There were a couple issues. FinCEN had put out some guidance. Libra had launched, and there was a lot of conversation around that. But now that we could have issues around market structure, taxation, stablecoins, illicit finance, it's amazing how mature this conversation has gotten since the last time you were in government.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the industry's evolved quite a bit too. So as the industry's evolved, so has the government's thinking. And I think one thing that should, maybe it's not surprising to your audience, but what was really comforting to me coming back into the government to work on these issues exclusively is the knowledge that the career staff have in not only this department, but across the government on the policy issues in digital assets. It's quite voluminous. So I think there's been a lot of interest in the policy over the years. And I think there's now a lot of excitement to actually be working and tackling the issues.
It's just an incredible moment to be doing this type of work.
It's fun.
In this role, absolutely fun. And just what strikes me here is just how many different issues there are that you address here. Digging into the report, obviously you were one of the primary authors. Treasury took a leading role along with other agencies. Would you just talk about the process, right?
Sure.
The executive order drops, says, all right, Tyler, you're going to have a lot of work to do over the next few months. Off to the races. Like, what happens next?
Well, so the working group that was established in President Trump's executive order on January 23rd, it really set up an integrated process to deliver on this report and other policy items. So the working group established David Sachs as the chair he's the AI and crypto czar. He's the chair of the president's working group on digital assets. And then Bo Hines serves as the executive director of the working group. But in the working group, you can see that there's the Treasury Secretary, Commerce, DOJ, SEC, CFTC, OSTP, National Security. There's a long laundry list of really important components of the government's policy apparatus that are involved in the working group. And, Treasury is the chief economic spokesperson for the U.S. We're a finance ministry. We collect taxes. There's a lot of things that happen at the Treasury. And, if you think about Treasury as a building, in the building, we have 3 sort of core components that make up the departmental offices at Main Treasury. We have domestic finance. Domestic finance really works with our domestic partners on U.S. domestic policy issues, whether it's banking, whether it's capital markets and securities. They serve as the debt management function of our office and like the fiscal agent as well. So they sell our debt to the rest of the world. It's a pretty important function of the U.S. economy. The international affairs is sort of, I would colloquially refer to it as sort of the finance ministry component of the Treasury building. It does the diplomatic engagement with other foreign counterparts. It serves as the external lead when engaging in the standard setting bodies and other international fora. And then we have the terrorism and financial intelligence vertical, which houses FinCEN as the bureau within that. They do all of the MSB, money services business registration. And then they also administer OFAC. So there's really a broad array of policy issues that this building handles. And what's interesting about my job in particular is when I came in, I sort of serve as a counselor to the secretary, but I work across all three of those sort of verticals, and then obviously some of the other bureaus that are within Treasury, like the IRS as well.
Which is really critical because, I mean, this report is a great example of it, but we've all known for years crypto touches everything.
Yes.
Right? From domestic finance to counterterrorism to all these sorts of issues that Treasury uniquely deals with, as opposed to other financial regulators, which have, I think, maybe slightly more narrow mission sets.
Absolutely. I think that's totally fair. After the executive order came out, what Bo and David did that was particularly helpful is they set up an interagency process where we had twice a week meetings dating back to the end of January, early February. We had twice a week meetings. We sketched out an outline of what we thought would be sort of like the bones of how to write the report. And we thought about sort of the core issues that we wanted to speak about. And we did that from sort of two different lenses. Like one lens was, what are the problems that we're trying to solve for? And like, how do we give certainty to the industry in the US such that they're not looking for other jurisdictions around the world that are providing them that certainty? So how do we win by building a durable framework in the US? And then what the executive order asked us to do is contemplate both legislative and regulatory recommendations. And so you'll see in the report, we really lay out, here are the near-term things that we can do from a sole regulatory perspective, and then here are the things that we need Congress to act on. And we've obviously seen Congress racing ahead to act, which is quite good. It makes our job
Absolutely
interesting because there's this dynamic of like, what do we say and how do we push things over the goal line versus like, what do we need to say that is going to be instructive to how they need to think about something or how we want them to think about, how we want legislators to think about the issues.
That's what's really in part so extraordinary about this. You watching the last 6 months in the US and you have the writing of this report happening mostly behind the scenes. And then you have all the movement in Congress on Capitol Hill that's very much in the public domain, putting out discussion drafts and, other information, holding press conferences. And you're watching legislation developed and then ultimately pass when it comes to the Genius Act while you're drafting this report. Did this change the way you were thinking about the report at all?
I think it certainly changed the way that we wrote about.
Sure.
It changed the way the words on the page. I think that's fair to say. And I think, the other thing that was going on during the whole process is we did meetings with over 1,000 different participants from a working group perspective. And I think that was really instructive to the concerns or considerations that they have that were very much sort of in a principal relationship. So it's one thing for, a company or a think tank or a group of academics to advocate to Congress. It's a different thing for them to be interacting with their regulator and saying like, well, here's the actual pain point that we have with you. And I think that's helpful because we want to have transparent government, and especially in policy making, like you need that so you can address acute pain points and you can figure out issues.
One hallmark, I think, of the administration over the last few months, and certainly it sounds like in the writing of this report, is that openness, is that dialogue with industry. You mentioned a series of roundtables. The SEC task force is now famously meeting with everyone. From a process perspective, talk a little bit about the way you were engaging with industry.
I think it was a two-way street. So we took every meeting, and that's just rule number one of government. I think you just take meetings and talk to people here about issues. So I think when people saw that there was this apparatus that existed at the working group level with Bo and David, there was a natural vector for them to go communicate. And then when I came into Treasury, there was another sort of entry point for conversations to happen. When we got a little farther in the process in terms of writing the report, we identified areas that we needed to sort of backfill our thinking on. And we did roundtables on banking and sort of novel entrants or new entrants in the banking system to learn more about the pain points there. And then we also did roundtables on decentralized finance and particularly DeFi from a cybersecurity perspective, from an illicit finance perspective and what we needed to think to do to counter illicit finance. And then we did it on stablecoins as well. And we did one on stablecoins because we saw sort of the evolution of the legislation in Congress, and it, nothing's certain on Capitol Hill, but it looked like there was critical mass to getting to a outcome on the legislation. So we really wanted to do that, sort of backfill our thinking of how does stablecoins and DeFi fit together, and how do we need to think about it a little bit more critically from a countering illicit finance level.
Let's just stay there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many interesting issues, right, to pull apart. It's that sort of convergence of DeFi, stablecoins, and the illicit finance piece. Would you talk a little bit about sort of the parts of the report that you see as really handling that or thinking about it?
Yeah. I mean, part of the Genius legislation has sort of an ecosystem monitoring element for the issuers. And one of the sort of core issues I think that has confounded the industry is how far does that go along the life cycle of like whatever token or product or stablecoin, whatever it is. And I think where we need Congress to give some support is like creating sort of that clear delineation within DeFi. And I think that's important because everyone understands, or most people in the digital asset policy making community understand that, what control means within the decentralized finance community is a challenging question. And where you can have Congress backfilling and really creating clarity, it helps the regulators, it helps the implementers of the BSA, and it helps the financial institution construct to be able to do sound, safe enforcement and do good supervision of regulated entities. And if you think about where Genius plays into that, where the stablecoin legislation plays into that, what we're really talking about is putting US dollars that are high quality liquid assets. If you look at the asset mix of the Genius legislation, it's mostly made up of really short dated treasuries. And when you put those treasuries and you mint a stablecoin and you put it onto a permissionless blockchain, you have real speed at the movement of money, and it can create efficiencies in lots of different areas. But one of the challenges is that we need to think about when we're implementing Genius, we're going to go through this process. We really need to think about what that means from an AML level and what that means from seeing sort of like the flow of stablecoin movement.
It's terrific. In the conversations I've had on the Hill around Genius and the conversations leading up to this report, there was this unique understanding, I feel like, of there are stablecoin issuers have, capabilities in the AML space, the capability for ecosystem monitoring, burn and reissue.
Yep.
And it's interesting to see a lot of that really fleshed out in a way that I've never seen it fleshed out in this report.
Yeah.
We're only going to scratch the surface of this report today. I really, really encourage people to read it. This is probably the most comprehensive 20 pages on illicit finance that have ever been written in crypto, because it really hits sort of all the areas. One thing I talk about all the time is how do you as a regulator thread that needle between allowing lawful users the degree of privacy that they need in an open financial system and yet stop illicit actors from taking advantage of transformative technology. There seems to be this push and pull in the report of, hey, this is what we need to do. We can't stifle innovation, but we have to stop bad actors. And that seems to be ultimately where you're looking to study more, where you're looking to understand a lot of these issues more.
There are small instances in which bad actors use digital assets for illicit purposes. And we obviously want to go after and make sure that we're interdicting that as much as possible. I think there's many ways that you can sort of accomplish that. One is better public-private partnerships, like working with industry so that we have better analytics capabilities, working with industry so we get threat identifiers like on a faster baseline so that law enforcement and our regulators know when something is sort of like a red flag. And the other macro one is if you build a well-regulated system in the US and you create legal certainty, onshoring that activity into the US is a great way of protecting like the health and the viability of the industry, not only in the US, but external as well. And I think one of the interesting pieces of the Genius legislation is it creates an environment to enter into reciprocal arrangements. And we haven't gotten into this like detailed analysis yet, but one of the components of it is evaluating other jurisdictions' regulatory regimes and other jurisdictions' laws. And if you believe what I believe, which we have like the best, most robust framework and legal requirements in the US, if you believe that, then I think you should expect us to hold other foreign jurisdictions to a higher standard.
Fantastic. We were talking a couple minutes right before we jumped on camera about sort of the thing. I just asked you sort of like, what are you most proud of from the report? And you mentioned specifically sort of the way you're working to protect DeFi and developers. Would you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we sort of borrowed a lot from what we've seen Congress work on this and sort of worked backwards from there of like, what are the principles that we're talking about and how does it fit within like the BSA AML regime? And what I'm talking about is the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act that has bipartisan support in the House and has been inserted in the Clarity Bill. What it really sort of gets to is sort of the level of control that a developer has over deploying code. And I think that is important because if we create sort of more certainty around what that means in like actual prescriptive legal definitions in the US code, there isn't this sort of like massive open question for the development community of if I'm building X project or if I'm building X front end, what are my responsibilities? What are my obligations? And is there going to be sort of this sword of Damocles hanging over me with regard to someone else's potential maluse of the technology that they're building? And I think that we get close to it. And there's a long section in there about sort of like control and
honestly, the definitions even up front and the description of DeFi is also one of the best I've seen, which obviously the industry engagement there is very, very clear.
Yes. Yeah, and it's funny, we talked about the settings in this room. One of the roundtables that we did actually on this very issue was in this room, and it was quite an exercise debate as you as when you saw here. Oh, yeah.
But also just really important that was the starting point here. It was like, hey, we want to define this, we want to understand it, because I think particularly when you talk about decentralized finance, there's a lot of different views of what it actually is and the level of decentralization. And it's clear that this report really addresses that. That's fantastic. There was one thing I wanted to come back to real quick. You were talking about sort of the AML provisions here that are providing some clarity to services, to whether it's exchanges, VASPs, essentially. One is this hold rule. Would you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, again, it was an idea that sort of was discussed quite significantly in one of our roundtables that we did on decentralized finance. We did one that was explicitly focused on stablecoins. And many of the participants, and particularly sort of from like an issuer level, when they get lawful orders from law enforcement and it says, okay, we've identified X address or X token, and we know specifically that it is touched a sanctioned person or a sanctioned address. What they're talking about really is providing some flexibility in terms of the ability to hold the transaction in the life cycle so that they can do some better identification and do some analysis on like the address, the wallets, and all of the ecosystem part of that, and giving flexibility for the issuers to really understand what their requirements are. And I think it's something that is open for debate, but if you thread the actual language properly, it can provide some better hygiene in the sector by providing flexibility, sort of hold the flow of funds.
Yeah, no, it felt really important to me and dovetailed, and I think I was calling it a safe harbor provision. It's different than the safe harbor provisions in other places around market structure, but it feels very consistent with that. It's like, hey, let's give a little bit more leeway, at least right now, for builders, for services, to allow them to make a mistake here or there, but to innovate.
Yes, and I think if you juxtapose it versus traditional finance, like there are embedded sort of clearing and settlement timelines within traditional finance where the time horizon of sending money from a bank in the US to a bank in some other jurisdiction, it's just longer. In the transposition of stable coins, the time horizon is much more compressed. So providing a little bit of flexibility in the flow can really help where there are edge cases.
Fantastic. One area that is hot right now, and a lot of discussion on Capitol Hill, is taxation. There's an entire section dedicated to tax. I'm not a tax lawyer. I don't even fake it till I make it on that issue. I send people elsewhere. But I do think it's become more and more of an important issue on Capitol Hill and here at Treasury as the tax collector. Would you just talk a little bit about that section?
Well, I can't thank the Office of Tax Policy here enough. They were super helpful. What I've learned most acutely in tax policy world is that every single word matters very specifically because it all has re-references to different revenue rulings and different cases that have happened in tax land. So it's quite challenging, but really important work. I think there's been a continued building of momentum in Congress to address some of the acute issues in the digital asset tax world, whether it's like the wash sale rules, whether or not it's like the timing, the disposition of income. One of the other major issues that I would flag is there are tax considerations for like actually building a company and deploying a project in the US. We have seen many of the big treasury companies and we've seen many of the big projects, the labs, really domesticate in other jurisdictions because of corporate infrastructure and tax considerations. One of the sort of visions for the president's January 23rd executive order was, what do we need to fix to onshore the innovation? And those are big issues that we need to fix to onshore innovation. We have to create a parallel framework from a tax level for them to want to domicile in the US.
It's really well said. And, it's interesting. I've had some tax lawyers and IRS officials on TRM Talks, and I think those who explain it in that way, that, tax law is really policy. It's how can we incentivize businesses, individuals to build in the US in this case. And that's why it's really, really critical.
The whole report is about what we need to do to fix the US policy framework and what we need to do to incentivize builders and developers and projects and companies to be in the US. If you want to collect revenue and you want to create incentives for them building in the US, you have to fix tax issues because it's part of the decision-making process that any founding team and any development team would go through of where they want to be.
I'm going to finish off with an AML question, and I think there's a lot of focus in those 20 pages on the importance of public-private partnerships. And I know that's always sort of like the easy recommendation, right? Oh, do more public-private partnerships. But crypto actually enables us to do it better. We can move faster for interdiction. We can marry crypto exchanges and other vast stablecoin issuers with FBI and Secret Service and Homeland Security to really have real-time information sharing. And I feel like that's what this report is getting at, is the promise of that to be able to stop bad actors. What was your take on sort of that part of this?
Absolutely. I think it's like pretty critical. And from having worked at Treasury, like we do these things called tabletop exercises and Hamilton Project and those types of joint public-private sector engagements. And those are all really instructive to how the building thinks about policy issues, but they also create sort of a venue for information sharing. And like maybe if you build the right environment, you can ultimately get to sort of critical issues that we haven't really addressed that we do discuss in the report. But one area I'm thinking of is digital ID and privacy and reliance. When you go do AML checks and requirements and identification checks with a financial institution, like portability of that to other vehicles and other institutions, so you don't have to redo the same identity verification and AML checks with another regulated intermediary. Like that gets really important because you're breaking down sort of another threat vector for a human. And I think all of these public-private partnerships, if built right, can really work.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to get you out with this one. And like you and I have talked a little privately about just how cool this job is, particularly in this moment where you're literally shaping law, you're shaping policy. When I talk to lawyers in this space, there's this sense of like, wow, there's never green space for legal arguments, right? It's all already been litigated. Here, it truly is, right? You're building the law, you're building the policy from the ground up. You teach law students. Talk to me a little bit about like how you think of this moment from the role that you have and what you're really building for future generations.
Well, it's a loaded question, complicated answer. The job is really fun. It's fun to work with like dedicated, like smart people who like want to solve challenging issues. It's even more fun and sort of more exciting to see how much sort of interest there is across sort of the regulatory infrastructure in the US on these issues. And I think it's critical that we try to solve some of the problems. Best part about the job, you get to talk to a million different people and learn from really smart builders and developers. I think that's a lot of fun. And get to work with Congress on trying to advance legislation. So I'm having a blast. Is it exhausting at times? Absolutely, but it's a ton of fun.
It is evident that you're having fun and are exhausted some of the time. Tyler, thank you so much for joining TRM Talks. What I would say to folks, I get asked probably one question more than any other, and that's, what should I read to get up to speed on crypto regulation, on policy? Read this report. It's 160 plus pages, but it is packed with every area to get you up to speed. So thank you for putting this out, even just from that perspective.
Yeah, I'm biased, but I think it's the most comprehensive report that any government has put out on digital asset policy.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good to be with you.
This was such a cool conversation on so many levels. Let me just even start with the room that we're in right now. Being in the cash room, a place I spent some time during my 2 years at Treasury, is just so special. And I love the way Tyler talked about, hey, look, this was the banker's bank where cash and coins were stored at the US Treasury Department. And now we're talking about digital assets, right? Funds that move at the speed of the internet. And what a cool way to sort of kick off this conversation. And then really just the report. And to have this opportunity to sit down with the primary author of one of the most important reports written by any government on digital assets. And I think what I was really struck by in the conversation and really in the report is just the depth in each of these sections, whether it's on market structure, whether it's on taxation, and certainly AML, which is our focus, 20 pages dedicated to illicit finance. And he really walked through those different sections, the hold provision, talking about how public-private partnerships are absolutely key in the age of blockchain technology, where you can actually trace and track funds, funding for tools and training. So really just a conversation in so many different areas in a really, really important report today. On the next TRM Talks, I sit down with Joey Garcia of Zappo Bank. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it. And follow us on LinkedIn to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, let's get back to building.